Most of James's stories fall into one or the other of two categories: those set in his own lifetime, in which antiquarian law is employed to delineate the survival of a ghost from earlier centuries, and those set rather earlier, generally from the 17th to the earlier half of the 19th centuries, in which James draws upon his quite considerable store of erudition to create as authentic a setting as possible. The range of this erudition can be quite surprising. One story, the story of a disappearance and an appearance, for instance, seems to reveal a more than slight acquaintance with the history of the Punch and Judy shows. There is a third category from which the antiquarian element is missing. This includes such pieces as a school story, or After Dark on the Playing Fields, and Wailing Well. The last named tale was written to be read to the Eton troop of Boy Scouts. This difference from his usual audience probably accounts for James's omission of an element which would have been more likely to have puzzled the boys than to have added to their appreciation of the story. That it is an effective story, despite this difference from the greater bulk of his work, I can testify. It was one of the first M.R. James ghost stories I ever read as a boy, and at the time it terrified me so much that I could barely stand to finish it. But antiquarianism, then, is neither an inevitable nor a necessary part of James's storytelling technique. That it does predominate in his stories is to be explained by the circumstances of their genesis. I've said that their writing was something in the nature of a game. The earlier tales, in fact, were written for James to read aloud to gatherings of friends on Christmas Eve. Those in his first published collection originated in this way. Collectively titled Ghost Stories of an Antiquary, they are avowedly the work of a scholar writing about the things he understands. As C.S. Lewis explained in the preface to the abridged edition of That Hideous Strength, I selected my own profession because my own profession is naturally that which I know best. And the same words could apply very easily to M.R. James. The stories were written for the enjoyment of the author and his friends, with whom he shared many interests, tastes, and experiences. James was able to take for granted a level of comprehension on the part of this original audience, which he could not have assumed had he been writing with his later and wider readership in mind. He was also writing with the knowledge that his use of antiquarianism would be appreciated by his audience, as it evidently was by himself. One element in this appeal is the pastiche, for which the best example would have to be Martin's Close. James was a frequent reader of the State Trials, a set of records from which he derived considerable pleasure, and he admitted to a particular fondness for cases tried before the notorious Judge Jeffreys. In Martin's Close, he has created his own Jeffreys trial, perhaps motivated by the same urge which makes admirers of Sherlock Holmes attempt to write new cases not covered by Watson, the desire for more of a good thing. It may be remembered that Raphael Sabatini does something similar in the opening chapters of Captain Blood. The writing of pastiches shades quite imperceptibly into the fabrication of what James called fragments of ostensible erudition, an old game practically confined to scholarly circles. Practitioners have included John of Salisbury, the friend of Thomas Becket, who used to invent classical authors for the amusement of his friends. J.R.R. Tolkien, of course, who gave us the Red Book of Westmarch, complete with marginalia, scribal colophon, and a history of the transmission of the text. C.S. Lewis, whose commentary on Tolkien's Lay of Leithian quotes with the full panoply of modern textual criticism, variant readings from half a dozen non-existent manuscripts, and the opinions of as many equally imaginary scholars. This sort of thing frequently involves an element of parody. James didn't only practice it when writing ghost stories. A pastiche of 1887 masquerades as a newly discovered fragment of the Middle English version of Mandeville's Travels, in which not only are the Parthenon friezes described as scenes from sacred history, but the preface begins with the most perfect imitation in English of the very nearly opaque dialect of much German scholarship. We can glance aside to the circle which gathered around another writer of supernatural horror, H.P. Lovecraft. The case of this group demonstrates that this is a game which can only be carried on by those with a certain level of expertise. Lovecraft himself was a well-read amateur scholar, and he created in the Necronomicon one of the world's great non-existent books. With a textual and publishing history so convincingly worked out that those libraries which he credited with the possession of a copy occasionally received requests for permission to consult it. Others of Lovecraft's friends and correspondents imitated his creation, but only Robert E. Howard's Unausprechlichen Kulten, the work of an early 19th century German traveller and savant, manages to be at all convincing. And that perhaps because Howard was himself quite well read, and because he chose to plant his creation in 19th century Germany, the milieu of Baron von Humboldt and the Brothers Grimm, rather than, as was the case with Clark Ashton Smith's Book of Eidon, in the lost continent of Hyperborea. One is reminded of James's stated preference for a story grounded in familiar but slightly distant things, over one bolstered by the pseudoscientific language of modern occultism. One might add, or the raptures of unbridled fantasy. If an imaginary creation is to be convincing, it cannot afford to be associated too closely with other imaginary creations. Some of James's stories incorporate scraps of what can only be described as the professional antiquary's wishful thinking. A View from a Hill, for instance, features a pair of homemade binoculars which offer the user, in the most literal sense, a glimpse of the past. And unfortunately, they can't be taken into churches. An aside in Canon Alberic's scrapbook, strictly irrelevant to the story itself, must be regarded as what W.S. Gilbert called corroborative detail intended to give artistic verisimilitude to an otherwise bald and unconvincing narrative. The discovery, in the scrapbook which gives this story its title, of a fragment of the work of Papias on the words of our Lord. Papias, an early 2nd century bishop whose life overlapped that of the evangelist St. John, compiled in 5 books a collection of contemporary traditions about the teachings of our Lord. The few surviving scraps and references barely cover 1/4 page of small print. This work, if it survived today, might almost enjoy the authority of the 5th Gospel. James never quite realised the wish expressed here to make a discovery of this magnitude. He did not fall far short, however, with his discoveries of the unique Latin fragment of the Book of Enoch, and 7 years after the writing of Canon Alberic's scrapbook, of the only substantial extant fragment of the penitence of Jannes and Jambres, referred to in the New Testament at 2 Timothy 3:8.